Okay, so that's, you know, the annuals versus the perennials, and the monocrop, of course, is if you've driven through Nebraska or Idaho, or, you know, whatever, Iowa, Ohio, any of that, you know, the Midwest, the flyover states, right? Well, it's miles and miles and miles of corn or soy or wheat. That is a monocrop. The planet does not want to be a monocrop, because what the planet wants is that dense community of plants and animals all working together to create more life. When you decide to take up agriculture, it means that the soil can't be protected anymore, because you have to clear away the protective perennial polyculture. It has to be exposed in order to plant those seeds. There are no roots holding the soil from below. There's no cellulose protecting it from the top. And just like us, when soil is exposed, it dies. The sunlight cooks it, the rain compacts it, the wind blows it away. And what should be habitat for millions of creatures doing that basic work of life, it turns to salt and dust. Agriculture is carnivorous. What it eats is entire ecosystems, and that's what it has done across the globe. To state the obvious, no culture that is destroying the basis of life itself can be called sustainable. It can only be called insane. But this is where it gets very strange, because it's exactly those agricultural foods that are promoted by environmentalists as the way to save the planet. It's actually how we've been destroying the planet, but it's like we want to save the world without ever knowing it. Agriculture has now run through every continent, well, except Antarctica. But that's okay, because we're going to get that one with global warming. Agriculture actually marks the beginning of global warming. If you take all the carbon we've added since 1800, the beginning of the industrial age till now, if you back that up 10,000 years, actually from that period, the beginning of agriculture to 1800, as much carbon was added into the atmosphere, because you're destroying the huge carbon sinks of those perennial polycultures. So let's see. Okay, beginning of global warming. It's also the beginning of militarism, and it's the beginning of slavery. In the 7 centers where agriculture started, human society follows the same pattern. The word for this is civilization. So the really basic definition of civilization is life in cities. Agriculture is what makes civilization possible. Now, when I say civilization, I'm not talking about a good thing. It's people living in settlements big enough that they require the importation of resources. It means that by definition, they've overshot their land base. So you can see why this might not be such a good thing. To make this very clear, this is a quote from Clinton Callahan. Since the dawn of civilization, this pattern repeats itself over and over again. Civilization is largely the creation of psychopaths. All civilizations, our own included, have been built on slavery and mass murder. Psychopaths have played a disproportionate role in the development of civilization because they're hardwired to lie, kill, cheat, steal, torture, manipulate, and generally inflict great suffering on other humans without feeling any remorse. So, the pattern of civilization is there's this bloated power center surrounded by conquered colonies, and there are always colonies, and the power center extracts what it wants. So, can you find the psychopath in this picture? Now, agricultural societies end up militarized for 3 reasons. 1, agriculture creates that surplus. If it can be stored, it can be stolen. So you need somebody to protect it. Those people would be called soldiers. Number 2, imperialism. Agriculture is essentially a war against the natural world, and it means you are always using up your natural resources, starting with the soil, moving on to the trees. You know those great big ships that they used to build out of wood that were, you know, how imperialism spread around the globe? It takes 600 old-growth trees to make one of those ships. So that's the amount of resources that go into war. People do not willingly give up their land, their water, their topsoil, their trees. It means that you have to have somebody who's going to go out and get it and bring it back. Again, those people are called soldiers. So there's this entire class of people whose job is war, to go out and be the military. Agriculture makes that possible. It also makes it inevitable because you're always using up your own. And number 3 is the slavery. Some of those resources are other human beings. Agriculture is backbreaking labor. For anyone to have any kind of leisure time in an agricultural society, somebody has to do that labor. I mean, we talk about, Athens as being the great birthplace of Western democracy. 90% of the population was slaves, enslaved people. For a hunter-gatherer, it takes about 17 hours a week to provide for your basic needs. It's, you know, the original life of leisure. For farmers, it's dawn to dusk. It never ends. We've lost the cultural memory of this because we've been using fossil fuel for about 150 years to power machines to do that work for us. But if the energy used by the average American had to be produced by humans, we would all have 300 slaves. That's how much fossil fuel this way of life depends on. And if you've got that amount of the population living in slavery, you're going to need somebody to keep them there. So once again, those are the soldiers. This is the cycle we've been on for 10,000 years. Now, by 1800, the year 1800, when the fossil fuel age begins, 3/4 of the world, 3/4 of the people on the planet were living in some form of slavery, serfdom, or indenture. Now, the only reason we forgot that is because of the fossil fuel age. When the fossil fuel runs out, we are going to remember exactly how much work is involved in this way of life. So that's the feedback loop. The entire system needs to keep taking the land because it's forever using it up. So they're always going out to grab more. Eventually, the whole cycle collapses. Now, it used to be limited by distance, because without the internal combustion engine, you could only get so far using, you know, human locomotion and pack animals. And it meant that the central command, you know, you could only get, it took months sometimes for orders to come and go, for the military to get, you know, the situation back and forth and to make decisions about what they're going to conquer next. Eventually, the whole thing would just collapse because of distance. You just can't keep the supply line going that far when you've only got, you know, elephants or mules or, you know, oxen, whatever it is you're using. You know, with, of course, the fossil fuel age, that limit has been removed. And at this point, the whole system's gone completely viral. I mean, it's absolutely global in terms of conquering. There's never been before this small amount of people controlling this amount of the planet. I mean, this is just beyond Caesar's wildest imaginings. And that was all made possible by fossil fuel. So, there aren't any new continents. Atlantis is not actually waiting to be discovered outside of our past life regressions. By the year 1950, the planet was pretty well out of topsoil. All the major grain-growing regions of the world had been played out. And at that point, what should have happened was the inevitable crash. You know, we were using drawdown and it was over. What happened instead was the Green Revolution. And to quote Richard Manning, with the possible exception of the domestication of wheat, the Green Revolution is the worst thing that has ever happened to the planet. Now, he says that because instead of that correction of the human population, what we had was a quadrupling of the human population. And all of that was based on fossil fuel. When the fossil fuel runs out, we will be faced with the inevitable one more time. Only this time, it's going to be 4 times worse. So, food plus apocalypse. Now, at this point, if you're eating grain, you're eating oil on a stalk. You're not just eating fossil soil, you're actually eating fossil fuel. It takes the equivalent of 3 to 4 tons of TNT per acre for the modern American farm. Iowa alone uses the energy equivalent of 4,000 Nagasaki bombs every year. When I talk about agriculture as a war, it's not a metaphor. I mean it literally on every level. Now, by definition, this is never going to be sustainable. What the planet needs is not more of the same. That's at the very center of why the political vegetarians are wrong. It doesn't matter how noble the goals are, and they are noble. Destroying the basis of life itself is not going to save this planet. And the only reason we don't understand this is because we're urban industrialists. Even if we live in rural areas, it's still a very industrial life. We have no idea what our living planet needs. We don't even know what it should look like after 10,000 years of this destruction. So I'll tell you. What our planet needs is for us to repair those perennial polycultures. The planet wants to be a forest. She wants her wetlands back. And she really wants to be a prairie. If we simply get out of the way, those living communities will return. And there will be a strong and resilient web of biotic relationships once more on this planet. And we could take our place as members of a soil-building community instead of as parasites and destroyers. We could also make it happen faster. I mean, we could help the prairie return. We could put the buffalo back on it. We could take down every last dam and let the salmon return. We could help restore the forests. And ultimately, we need to be eating food that comes from within those living communities, not the food that comes from destroying them. That's what we ate for our first 4 million years on this planet. It's only in the last 10,000 that we've turned into monsters. Now, one of the reasons I became a vegan, I wanted my life to be possible without death. I wanted it so badly, I was willing to eat some frankly disgusting substances and to damage my body. This is what I didn't understand. A prairie without ruminants will turn to desert. The grass needs to be eaten as much as the bison need to eat it. But ruminants without predators will also turn that prairie to a desert by overpopulating and overgrazing. So the bison need to be eaten as much as the wolves need to eat them. We are all predators until we become prey. We're just taking turns. And in the end, the soil eats us all. That realization was a moment of grace for me, not easily won. I tried so hard to find a way out of death, but it's a doomed project because life and death are literally the same moment. So this is way bigger than what's dead on your plate. You have to ask, what died to get that food onto my plate? And in the case of agriculture, the answer is everything. When I look at my dinner, I want a full accounting. And it's accounting that goes way beyond what's in front of me. That's the more radical question, and it's the only question that will get to the truth. How many rivers were dammed and drained? How many prairies were pulled up? How many forests chopped down? How much topsoil turned to dust and blown into ghosts? I want to know about all the species, not just the individuals, but the entire species, the bison, the salmon, the terns, the wolves, and I don't just want the number of dead and gone. I want them back. So these are our options. There's the cycle, the death that's part of the cycle of life, and then there's the death that's destroying all life. We can dominate or we can participate, but there's not actually any way out. Edward Hyams makes the same distinction. He says, we can be members of a soil community, so we can participate in building and protecting that soil. We could take our nourishment from inside those living communities that our planet naturally organizes, or we can be soil parasites by doing agriculture. So I'm actually going to skip a little bit because I think we're running short on time. Okay. Let's see here. You know, if somebody during question and answer wants to ask me about world hunger and industrial farming, and American grain is actually causing starvation. It will not solve the problem. There's 1 billion people right now who have been pushed off their farms due to agricultural dumping by the grain cartels. So, you know, it's another huge chunk of stuff that we've just gotten wrong, mostly out of naivete. We don't understand how the world economy works. But, you know, there's a lot I can say about that. But I think, given the time constraints, I'm just going to skip that for now. But if it's something we want to talk about during Q&A, we can certainly do that. If we want to talk just personally about what we should be eating, you know, there are some guidelines. I'm hesitant a lot of times to bring this up for reasons that I'll get into, but I know that if I don't address this, we're going to talk about it during Q&A, so we might as well get it over with. You know, what we should eat, it's going to be really different from region to region, and even from sort of micro-region to micro-region. You have to know the place that you live. You have to understand it. You have to understand what's possible there and what lives there. Who do you share this community with? And so there are some basic questions that can sort of help you come to some conclusions about that. The first is, does your food destroy topsoil or does it build topsoil? The second question would be, what kind of energy inputs go into this food? So is it fossil soil? Is it fossil fuel? Is it, you know, water that has to be pumped out of an aquifer that is now being drained? Does it mean destroying a river to get the water for the agricultural foods? Water falls out of the sky, and again, this is a limit that we need to recognize and to respect. So, you know, if the only energy into the system is sun and ambient rainfall, that, you know, is a good deal towards sustainability. And the third factor, of course, is distance. Does this food actually come from where you live, or does it come to you on that river of oil called the interstate highway system? Or worse, does it come from China? I mean, right now you can buy organic frozen peas from China. This is insane, right? So, you know, there's this great concept of your food shed, like you have your watershed. It's your food shed. It's basically, you know, how far could you walk in 2 days? That's essentially your food shed, 50 miles, 100 miles, something like that. Does that food come from that region? So those are basically your questions. You know, soil, which is another way of saying, is this an intact biotic community? Which is really a very complicated way of saying home.